I wanted to propose a little bit of a change up, not that much, but David has to get on a plane in about an hour. So he asked if he could go first and talk about the public engagement. And then that also might help us inform our conversation around sort of this major milestones exercise that you just finished. But for the moment, I'm going to turn it over to David to share his slides and walk you through the rest of the presentation. Welcome, David. Didn't have a chance to introduce you.
Hey, everybody. The question is if you can hear me okay.
I turned him up and I don't know. We haven't figured that out. So
I'll keep talking for a second and you tell me if it's terrible.
Loudly.
How am I doing? Is that better?
Not the same, but keep it up.
Okay, so I'll just keep talking loudly and please interrupt if you can't hear what I'm saying. And is now a good time to start, or do people need just a minute more to settle?
Everybody settled.
Everybody settled? Okay, great. And I'm sharing my screen here, which should be the slides. Oh, something just happened that was interesting.
Oh, it's on the ground.
Oh, I think it's right. Jared.
On off.
Let me know when I can start up again.
So he can't hear you.
Now you can go.
Okay. All right.
Great.
Excellent. Well, welcome everybody. I can barely see you, I have to admit, and I'm sitting in a little room in an airport, so I apologize. I'm not there with you. I have been listening into the conversation, so I have been capturing a good percentage of what you've been saying. And what I've heard is an emphasis on listening and incorporating voices and people and communities that haven't been as much part of the conversation. And I've heard that theme this morning and earlier today in your conversation. Let me walk you through briefly what my team is, and our team here at CBI has been thinking about in terms specifically on the issues of public engagement. And as a little bit of background here, as you've heard from Jane previously, when the state went out and made an RFP for continued facilitation services of the council, they combined it with public engagement services. And CBI, my organization, Catherine and I work for, bid on that and won that. And what I'm going to present now is the public engagement part of that. And for those of you who have been on the council for a while, you're going to recognize some of this because it's the work that the Public Engagement Task Group and the Just Transition Subcommittee have been working on and has even been presented up to the council at least once. And so some of this is going to feel familiar, and then some of it's going to feel like a step forward, hopefully, about the specificity of the kind of public engagement that we can help the State Climate Action Office and the council do in the coming years that hopefully meets the challenge and meets the needs that you all have been expressing today and previously, I'll say. So let me just walk through, I have just 3 slides, but they have a bunch of clicks through them. And then I'm open to obviously have a conversation, and hopefully Catherine can guide that better than I can, looking at a very small screen here. Before I go any further, quick, Catherine, feedback on sound quality, volume, etc. How are we doing?
I'm going to make you loud.
Doing well.
All right. I'm doing okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let me keep going. All right. So here we go. In terms of public engagement objectives, there's 3 that have been emerging over the last year or so through the Public Engagement Task Group. And let me lay them out. They, like I say, they will be familiar to some of you, right? So one of the three objectives is about enhancing awareness, right? This is getting information out. Today I heard Leslie Ann and others say we need to do a better job of distilling what's in the climate action plan. And I'll add to that other climate action efforts that are related to the plan, the implementation pieces, et cetera. So there's an enhanced awareness or a communication challenge and objective here that's part of the public engagement part, right? So it's a pushing information out that's particularly useful. A second objective is about lifting up voices and viewpoints of communities. And I think it was June who said earlier, let's be careful with our language because this is not a one-way street, right? We were about lifting up voices and viewpoints in the same way we want to provide information, right? And here you'll see on the slide, this is about particularly so a diverse group of Vermonters can influence the ongoing efforts of the Climate Council and the state of Vermont through its Climate Action Office. Okay, so that's objective number 2 is about lifting up those voices. And objective number 3 related to all these is about building relationships and communication channels so that the what today you're feeling as an insufficient set of conversations about climate action with a range of Vermonters, that doesn't have to be the norm going forward, that there are relationships, there are established communication channels that'll allow a more fluid conversation as ongoing planning and implementation happens in Vermont. Okay, so these are 3 objectives about getting information out, lifting up voices and viewpoints, and making sure they're part of the planning and implementation that's happening, and building relationships. All right, so what are we proposing to do helping as sort of consultant support in this space? The first thing is more standard, which is about public meetings, right? And it's important to do that. It's an act of transparency, and it's one way of reaching out. Many of these will be virtual. Some could be in person, and those are in person should have a thoughtful component of geographic diversity. And these kinds of meetings will be around the substantive areas of work for ongoing policy development and implementation. Okay, so you can imagine that substantively, if biomass or other issues are part of near-term planning, or in the longer term, as you start to prioritize the issues that require revision, those are the kinds of substantive things that public meetings would be great for. Okay, now, on the right side of the page here is where my team is particularly excited to start working. And let me just pause for a second and mention when I say team, we have a great team in place here, and several of you are going to know some of these folks. In addition to Catherine and myself and Pat Field, who you've known, and Cameron Hager, who've really been helping in the facilitation part of this work over the last couple of years. For the community engagement pieces, we have additional folks based in Vermont who are very familiar with this space. So many of you might know Kashka Arlo or Indra Archaya and another team member, Ann Nelson. Kashka and Indra have been deeply involved in the work of the Just Transition Subcommittee. They've worked with Sue and the Capstone on very good public engagement around climate and other issues. And they're just fantastic folks working in a space of public engagement with an eye towards just transition and equity. So Kashka, Indra, and Ann Nelson, and myself, along with Catherine, Pat, and Cameron, will all be doing this work. And we're really looking forward to this team as a way to be supportive of the goals that you're laying out there. So this whole other set of issues, these 4 buckets on the right-hand side, is where we're putting a lot of interest and effort to do things in addition to more traditional public meetings. So let me walk through them. You can see the first one is about developing and sustaining partnerships. We're going to do some very specific work around focus groups with communities whose voices haven't most been heard. We're going to be doing some creative ways of just getting out there and meeting people where they are. And our hope is to convene a climate action coalition of organizations. Let me say a few things about each. On the partnership idea, the public engagement task group and Just Transition subcommittee have been starting this work, or started it last year. We've started with conversations with CAP agencies, with the Council on Rural Development, and with other organizations, with an idea about building partnerships around specific asks and requests and channels of communication. So that's going to be hopefully solidified in 2023, so that we have partners with whom we can channel this kind of work. So that's the partnership side. On the focus groups, this is something that's been brewing for a while, and now we have the mechanism to do it, working with folks in the Just Transition Subcommittee around specific populations, an initial priority around immigrant and former refugee communities with language barriers, and doing focus groups that can overcome those language barriers. So that's a tool to use, and we're going to use that tool particularly in groups that really haven't been part of the conversation to date. And in terms of the frontline communities and meeting folks where they are, this is an opportunity for creativity. Kashka and Indra are fantastic. If Sue's in the room, she can attest to that. There's opportunities to just be out there, attending events, meeting people in gathering places, and much more. The Just Transition Subcommittee has done a good work around identifying communities that are considered to be frontline communities and priority communities for this kind of work, historically disadvantaged communities, and underrepresented communities. So that'll be the priority of the team. And there's a lot of enthusiasm in our team about getting out there and being creative in how we're engaging folks. And finally, on the coalition, pulling together organizations that are so busy with their work that maybe they haven't engaged at all directly in climate action in the council or the work of the state climate action office. And there's an opportunity to bring those folks together in a systematic way and build a community of practice around climate action. And again, climate action viewed broadly about how we heat our homes, how we get to work, right? How we are prepared for weather events like flooding and heat. And so there's a lot there that can be done. And I'm thinking about Abby as well in the rural space, in the agricultural space, about how to weave those voices in. I have one more slide, and I apologize if it's been irritating to hear my voice in this little speaker. There's 4 things that we're identifying as elements of success, and I am sure there are more, and I hope we talk about what the additional ones are. But the 4 that are front of mind for us, and one is, how do you realistically and genuinely build in feedback loops so that the decisions you make about how you're engaging and the subjects you're engaging on are coming from the actual priority conversations and priority implementation things that are happening either at the council or state government. And at the same time, there is a credible, predictable process so that what is heard out there through all this work of Kashka and Indra and all of us out in the community doing this, that gets lifted up and incorporated in the work of this council and in the work of state government, the Climate Action Office, right? So we need to have a mechanism, a methodology that everybody is comfortable with so that it really legitimately is part of the work, and not some separate wheel spinning off to the side. So that's one key thing that we're really focusing on, and would welcome thoughts on that. The other is focus, and it's about lifting up voices that are not the most heard. That will be our focus and guide, is how are we paying attention to that with a strong focus on frontline communities, groups that are underrepresented in the work to date. That requires being creative in how you are accessible and having equitable methods so that those voices do get lifted up. So we're trying to keep that focus always in mind. The word trust has come up in your conversation today. We think trust is a critical issue. There is a lack of trust among many communities. Someone mentioned it already today with state government, with state action. We want to work through partners and with cultural brokers where appropriate to help start to bridge those trust gaps. And the final piece I'll say is about respecting people's time. And I just caught the end of this conversation you had this morning when you were talking about the just transition reflection. And the way the state has structured the work through us is we have the capacity to compensate people for their time at a reasonable amount, particularly frontline and impacted community members for their time. And we recognize that we need to respect people's time. So that's being thoughtful about when we ask for people's time, and when we do ask for it, that there is some compensation that can be offered. And when I say compensation, I'm talking of like $25 to $50 for people's time in a meeting. But still, that's better than a zero, which oftentimes can be the case. So that's what I wanted to share coming from CBI's side, and we literally just signed the contract with the state. I think it was like 7 o'clock on Friday evening. So we're very happy to get going, and we want to have a conversation with you about guiding our work. So I'll pause. Catherine, turn it back to you. I can drop slides or keep them up as you wish. You guys are on mute, so I can't hear if you're saying anything.
It's fine.
Now, can you hear us?
Yes.
So why don't you drop the slides for now, and if somebody in the room wants to revisit them, bring them back up. They're in here. I think you guys had a chance to see them in advance anyway. They were sent. So, David, you had a couple of key things at the end there about questions that you wanted some. I'm assuming you want some feedback on. One was, what does? I'm curious to hear from you what the mechanism for feedback. This is actually a two-way feedback loop. How do you hear from communities what their priorities are and what they're telling us? And how do you also figure out what are your priorities and communicate that out to the public engagement, what you want to communicate out? So it's that two-way conversation. What does that look like? I mean, in reality, we want to hear from you. Is that a quarterly report to you from the public engagement team? Is that more frequent? Do you want to put that as part of your strategy and thinking about how, what you want specifically to get from the public engagement process and have that as part of your work plan? What does it look like?
Yeah.
And David, add on.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And those are the kinds of conversations I'd love to have today, in addition to other feedback, given everything you've spoken about this morning, right? And on that feedback loop, it could be as simple as, as Catherine says, a quarterly engagement summary that is part of your process as a council and as part of the Climate Action Office process. And so something as simple as that, but we need to have a predictability around it so that we can legitimately say we are listening, right? And there's a question mark in my mind, if you as a council, how do you want to express your listening as well, right? So those are kinds of questions I'd be intrigued to talk about, in addition to the other things that I suggested CBI is going to be focusing on as we coordinate with Jane and the Climate Action Office in this work.
So we have David, you wanted to add something.
You're stating quarterly report backs from CBI on community engagement. I think the council should have quarterly engagement with communities that you set up for us.
Okay.
And so that the people who are being affected, whose lives are being affected, whatever, aren't looking at a consultant. That's not a pejorative term, sir.
All good.
But they're looking at the face of a council that was set up by their state representative and their state senator and has engaged them. Now, I don't know, we've had this discussion about capacity. I don't know whether quarterly is appropriate or maybe once or twice a year is appropriate, but I don't want to be isolated away from direct contact in the community.
Hi, David. I know I'm off camera slightly. I'm decked with my hand. Will the council receive the schedule and location for meetings that you do put up such that they're public and we, like anyone, could attend? You had on
That's a
there
great
that you-
question.
Okay, well,
Yeah,
I would suggest that. That would help to David's point. Make sure that there is, even if not specific council focused community meetings, or perhaps in addition, either way, that council members in various areas of the state know exactly when those meetings are occurring and have the opportunity to attend. That would be helpful. And the other question I had is, do you know whether there's any current, I guess what I would call acknowledgement of community members who do attend? Obviously, when we have public comment at these meetings, we have an opportunity to say thank you as people make their comment. But there's a portal where people have been putting in comments. Right now, there's not a good mechanism other than one of us just going and checking it to see what those comments are. And I'm not aware of whether we're having a feedback loop back just to say thank you for participating. You know, here's our upcoming meeting schedule, anything to acknowledge that participation. And if the answer is no, or even if it's yes, can we build that into your process so that people have acknowledgement of the thanks we have for their participation, both in person and when they submit comments in writing?
Thanks, Liz. I mean, it sounds like a fantastic suggestion. And so on both pieces, the meeting piece, if there's events and things that are happening, to make sure that counselors are aware of it. And I would say as well, create a habit perhaps among counselors of participating in those types of events. Capacity, availability, obviously the caveat there. And then the sort of loose ends of current practice, right, of people not being acknowledged by comments they submit on a portal, or we know we've gotten questions about folks who comment during the meetings, wanting to feel like their comments are being appropriately listened to. So those are loose ends and things that can be absolutely woven in. So I appreciate those comments. And David as well, I mean, absolutely is all I can say. Absolutely, let's figure that out, because I agree. You all, to the extent your capacity allows you, you all will greatly benefit by getting us out of the way and you interacting directly.
So David, Kashka's in the room. I don't know if you knew she was here. She was able to join us. So she just wanted to add something, and then Julia.
Hi.
Absolutely, thank you.
Hi, everybody. Hi, David. I don't know if you can see me, but hopefully you can hear me. So I did want to add something, and I've been listening since this morning, even though I arrived late. I have been listening, and there's been so many great comments made. I think the first ones that I was, that were really resonating with me were Kelly's, as far as compensation and asking people to come to the table, et cetera, and hear their voices. I think you said it greatly with the Just Transitions, at the beginning of the Just Transitions conversation. And what I wanted to follow up with right now, since I'm going to be working with CBI, I'm really excited. I want to follow up with the trust factor. And I think that goes back to what we were just talking about, the feedback loop. I love David's comment about having counselors come and us kind of step out of the way. However, I keep thinking about capacity, because that's something that's come up for years now, the capacity of everybody having such little time to devote, because you have so many other things going on. We all do, as well as these people who are bringing their time to help us understand what they're going through on a daily basis, which, as an advising committee, the Climate Council should hear, because that's how we're going to advise, or you're going to advise the legislature of what programs or what rules or whatever happens next. Those voices need to be heard, because that's going to affect them the most, and we haven't really heard from them. So, and having said that, I think that when David said the feedback loop, we're really asking you to come up with what you think would work for you best. And I love the idea of counselors coming to the meetings, coming to, roundtables, coming to the events because we plan on being at events. I mean, that's the way that I think about engaging the community. We're going to be at these events. So if you can come to the events, great. We're going to let the climate office know. And in turn, I think the climate office can then let the counselors know if we can't be present at a climate council meeting. So that's going to be ongoing. However, I do think that it falls to the climate council to try to figure out what would be best. How can we best support you by giving this information to you and closing that loop so that you can carry it forward? Because otherwise that trust is broken within these communities. If they don't know, and if they don't understand that their voices that are coming forth and they're taking the time to bring their voices forward, and then it just gets thrown into the ether, it is again a box being checked off. So if you can think about really as a group, how it would work best for you, for us to deliver this information. If you cannot attend an event or a meeting or a roundtable or a focus group, that would be really great for us to know this process of how to communicate this information to you. And then in turn, how you can give us the information that you would like us to have engagement, community engagement on. I think there was a science and data meeting that I was in on that you guys were struggling to say, well, how are we going to get, how are we going to do community engagement? How are we going to get people's opinions on this? How are we going to do this? That's why we're here. We want to help you do this, and we want to help get that information to specifically communities that aren't typically at the table, but to everyone, that we can at the moment. So,
Thanks for that.
thank you.
And Julie.
I just want to make sure that there's clarity around not just the how, and I appreciate what Kashka was saying there, and I think that that's really important, but also the what we're soliciting input on, and whether the public engagement, and we have some discretion here, obviously, but whether the public engagement is really focused on questions to be answered in support of developing the next iteration of the climate action plan versus feedback on implementation. And I guess my assumption is it's more the former than the latter, but also acknowledging the climate office is in the process of hiring a communications coordinator. And a big part of their work is to help sort of not track progress, but communicate the progress that's being made and make sure Vermonters are able to see what the investments we're making in climate action are yielding in terms of outcomes. And so I think trying to figure out how all these pieces that are admittedly moving at the same time fit together is going to be important, but just don't want to lose sight of the what in addition to the how.
Any other feedback for David? Yeah.
So this is great, David, and thank you for laying it out the way you have to really help us with the framing of this engagement. Reflecting on Julie's comments, I think that what comes to mind for me is managing expectations. And I think this goes back to a conversation earlier this morning related to who is the council, what are they doing, and what can they influence, differing from what other entities may be doing or not doing. Because this goes to trust building, it's like, if people think we can do one thing and they're communicating with us about that thing, but we really can't help them for whatever reason, it's outside of our scope. We need to be able to convey that in an appropriate manner. So that's one thing. The second thing that we talked about in our breakout group was how does the input process from other
efforts that are feeding the work of the Climate Council, such as the carbon reduction strategy for transportation, and the comprehensive energy plan update. How do we, we are going through really dense public engagement for those efforts, and we will be targeting some of the same communities that will be targeted for this effort. And so how do we not do it twice, and complement the activities and not overburden people that we're trying to reach? Because we also have this equity effort going on, both one that's AOT started earlier, our equity framework process, but now there's an enterprise-wide state of Vermont equity process trying to engage with frontline communities for the body of all of our work. So it's just very complicated, and I don't expect a response to all of that, but it's just some observations that I'm having.
Yes.
And I might build off that because I think that's really important feedback. And I think the setting expectations is also incredibly important when we ask people for input. We need to be clear about what are the exact questions we're asking and building off a bunch of the work that's already underway. So I kind of want to sit with your plan for a little bit and offer more feedback. But I think it will be very important, the questions that we're asking and just clarifying, yeah, again, what our role is. And then also in terms of some of the other strategies, like, I mean, I'm sure you're well aware of this, but there are lots of coalitions, and these are really complex issues that are sometimes at tension with each other. So I just, my organization, we led the public engagement around the comprehensive energy plan twice, and we've been trying to do this work for a long time. We coordinate the network of town energy committees. Like, there's massive infrastructure in place. To Michelle's point, like, I'd very much, and I think others who are part of those coalitions, including the 31-member climate coalition that we coordinate, that pushed for the Global Warming Solutions Act, which included low income, disability rights, public health. Like, so there's just infrastructure in place. What I'm most excited about is what the work that you're describing, I think, is new, different, and needed, going to communities, engaging them differently. So I kind of want to sit with your plan and potentially offer more feedback. And I hope there's opportunity to do that related to, what are some of the questions that we're answering? I remember when we did the public engagement around the draft plan, I mean, it was a lot. And as we talked about earlier this morning, it was kind of chaos. But it was, I mean, people are like, they're like, well, we asked the question, what would you like us to do? And they're like, well, I don't know, like do the thing that's going to solve the problem. That's what I sat with 3 moms who were like desperately angsty about the crisis because their kids were in deep anxiety. And they're like, I don't know, I came here to learn what you're doing and I expect you, the experts, to do it. So I just think it's really, the expectation piece is really important, and building off of some of the infrastructure and then doing the exciting part that you're going to do differently to inform the different approach, I think will be really important. Just, we've been engaging people for a long time and ignoring them for a long time.
Yeah.
I raised my hand because I had a few things to say, but I don't want to interrupt what's going on in the room.
No other folks in the room. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, this is such great feedback and comments. And one thing I will note is, in addition to presenting to you all and having this conversation with you all, Jane and the Climate Action Office lead a group of sort of interagency group of folks around the climate implementation. To Michelle's point of like, there's a lot going on, and what should be done is additive to what's happening, not contradictory to, and that requires a little coordination. And there are mechanisms to have that coordination, which is good. So I think there is a great balance to be found between the appropriate level of planning and coordination and making sure no one's, we're not double doing anything or overburdening folks, while at the same time, not spending all of your time with that planning and actually getting out and letting Kashka and Indra and everyone go out and do the work. So we're looking for that balance of the right level of coordination and planning and making sure we're doing this well, and getting out there. I'll say one other thing, and it's about sort of the topical issues. I think for some of these communities that we really are enthusiastic about spending some time with, there's a whole set of initial conversations that are before you would get to any specific thing like biomass or some topical thing. So I think we just need to bake that into the way we're anticipating how this will happen, is there's a set of sort of initial conversations around these issues that aren't, say, very topically focused as a opening salvo. So I would anticipate that that's going to be what happens as we get going in this work and coordinate with other agencies and other folks who are doing the work as well.
But David, can I ask you to respond to Joey's request for sort of sitting with this and having another opportunity for feedback?
Yeah.
What would that plan? Or
So
detailed
I'll do.
plan?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely. The short answer is absolutely, and I feel like we're just literally this week starting the work, and part of the work is making an engagement plan, and so it's a great time for folks to sit with this, think about it, get in touch with Jane or myself or others, and in the coming weeks, because we're going to be making some clear definitions about this and responding to what we're hearing here, and also in that interagency group.
I just have, sorry. This is so exciting. One other just thought, maybe placeholder, but when you're going into communities, to your point, David, that people are going to be starting in a different place, it feels helpful if we're connecting with people that we have resources that may like go prepared with like, oh, you're struggling with housing, here are some agencies or resources. I think that, on some of these issues, it's a family that's like, I'd love to do that, but I can't afford it. And I'm like, well, now we have the Inflation Reduction Act and you should be aware of these incentives. I think we should go prepared, and I'm willing to help do some of that stuff. And I'm sure other people are as well. With our community action agencies have some of that information, but we should create a package that if we're going to be engaging with people, we can help answer that question if they have a need in that moment.
Yeah. I'll just completely second that. Thank you for saying that.
But I recognize if we don't have too much time to get into it further, but I want to put a couple of questions on the table. First, thank you, David and Kashka and everybody who's been involved for the development of this and the presentation of it. I did want to note that I would have loved to have seen a proposal, and we've talked about it for years here on the council, around deliberative polling, because I think that could really get at the two-way sharing, co-learning, not just starting from where we are, but then understanding how people's awareness and viewpoints are changing, both on the council and on the folks that we're engaging with as we learn and together and share information together. So I would be curious about why that approach doesn't seem to be included in the overall plan. And I will just say it's maybe expected as the data and analysis person, but and I know this was not CBI that did the first plan, the first public engagement effort, but one of the things that I was most frustrated about with that first effort, there were two things. One was just the breadth of the opening questions. They weren't focused in the way that I think Julie suggested, which is about the plan and the recommendations. It was like, what climate impacts are you seeing? Which is an interesting discussion item, but in terms of what can be actionable in terms of recommendations and the policy and programmatic recommendations we make, I do think that there's an opportunity to refine the specificity of the question so that they feel more actionable and relevant to folks. But then the other thing was, when we got all that polling data back, it was never broken down for us by geography. How many folks did we hear from this county? How many folks from this income group versus that income group, by race? And I think that is a really fundamental responsibility for us to understand who we're hearing from, how representative are they of the Vermont demographics as a whole versus where we may be missing folks, either living in a certain geography at a certain income level, a certain racial demographic, whatever it is. I think we really need to, whether it's in the focus groups or whether it's in the public meetings, we can't just say, well, we heard from a lot of people, because if we're trying to take a polling approach, I think the best practice in terms of the scientific way to go about it is a simple random sample with a large sample size. And we were not getting that. We were getting self-selected folks. So we don't know how representative those responses were. And we know that focus groups will not be representative necessarily, but they will be an important viewpoint. We just need to know who those folks are and then whom we may be missing to prioritize other communities going forward. And I want to make sure that we know that data, so we don't just say, well, we heard from X number of people, or we heard this. From a legitimacy and from a hearing from a representative group of folks and from different communities that are often underrepresented, I think we need to know that information as we go forward.
Thanks. And David, thank you for presenting. I don't want to cut this off prematurely. We can come back to it, but I also want to honor the fact that there's public waiting that only have until, some of them only until 2 o'clock to comment. So we're going to move to public comment, and I hope we will definitely come back to this conversation afterwards. Thanks, David. I know you have to get a plane.
Thank you, everybody. Go right to public comments. Fine.
Okay, thanks. Well, there's somebody online that has to leave in 5 minutes, so if we could take that person first. Is that Anna or?
Yes.
It is, okay. So can I just say before you get started, Anna, I don't know how many people have comments. We will extend the period if we need to, but just ask that all our public comments focus on the substance of the agenda today, of today's agenda, and also if you can keep it within 2 minutes, that would be greatly appreciated. So, Anna.
Yes, I can do that. So my name is Anna Mejia. I use she, her pronouns. I gave public comment at the last January meeting, naming the letter that we submitted behalf of the Renews BIPOC Council. I wasn't able to participate in hearing how the council, their own reflection, so I'll just name that. But I want the comment that I want to offer today is just naming that there's very important work that is being led by BIPOC community members that really center those voices. And I feel like I'm not seeing this council take nods to that work that is being led by BIPOC community members. And I'm also not seeing invitations for these organizations to share the learning that they've been uncovering through those efforts. And for just a very explicit example, many of you know that I also work as Vermont Organizing Director with Rights and Democracy Institute, who has been working with the Department of Environmental Conservation and with the Vermont Transportation Agency on equitable community engagement. And I have not seen once, reaching out to us to say like, hey, can you give input, around this community engagement plan? And even with regards to, I heard naming the Vermont Transportation Carbon Reduction Strategy, there was invitations that were sent out to organizations to participate in those stakeholder groups. Rights and Democracy was not part of that. This is an organization that is led by a Black woman that's leading this work. There's another Black woman who is leading the development of Environmental Justice Network. And it feels so glaring that they are not part of these conversations and there isn't nods to that very important work. And when I see this climate council that is so white presenting, that in the January meeting, I named how you have an opportunity. There's so many seats that are being up for reappointment. And I'm not seeing that representation, that call for an invitation to show us how you're centering these voices and making them including them in this table. I do not see that. And I don't want to say that as erasure to the voices, the BIPOC voices who do sit on this council presently or who have in the past. But I also want to name that it is isolating when you're one of very few who are part, and then it feels like you're having to speak for a whole community that is not monolithic. So again, I'm asking to do more to make sure that there is that representation. And even in getting the letter, for you to discuss that, we sent that back in September. And if I had not been present in January to read an excerpt of that, I don't know if there ever would have been a response. And there was a letter that was not only emailed directly to the Secretary of ANR and chair of this council, also physically mailed, and also sent to a host of other people. And even then, it just really fell through the cracks. And I also want to name that, sorry, I'm looking at notes and I know I'm part of time. I want to name 2 challenges that we've uncovered in just trying to get more of that representation of BIPOC community members at the table. Is one is the trauma that is involved when there was appointments of this Vermont Climate Council, or even the Environmental Justice Advisory Council. There are so many people. There's no shortage of us who are like ready to talk about this work, that are already involved in this work, but there was so few voices who were willing to step up because of a history of trauma, of marginalization, of erasure, of silencing, of retaliation for speaking truth. So that's one big challenge that needs to be addressed. And that's, again, why we sent that letter. And the other challenge is we cannot step up if there's people in this council who's not willing to step down. In the last meeting, I asked the people who were currently serving in some of these roles if you're willing to step back to allow other people who better represent these frontline communities, if they'd be willing to step back. And I do not see that happening. I myself even put an application to be the state, to be a representative for the environmental organization, because of the work that Rights and Democracy is doing, despite the hesitation that I have about being part of a public body, that I have experienced a lot of marginalization, erasure, all of those things. But again, I know that I can't be saying, hey, more representation, if I'm not willing to step into that position myself. And I also want to name, I heard you, Joey, talking about the NRC and the public engagement efforts that you've led with the Climate Action Plan and with the town energy committees. And I don't want to just pick on the NRC, but I want to speak to my own experiences. And those have been massive failures in engaging the BIPOC voices. I was part of those meetings where it was supposed to be in a BIPOC affinity space to talk about the climate engagement plan or climate action plan. And there was just so much harm that happened there that hasn't been addressed. And I feel really worried to say, like, oh, you all at the table are going to fix this when you did not experience that harm. And I don't know if you're even aware of those things. So there's a lack of trust there. That I've taken up a lot of space. So I'm just going to stop there. I do need to jump off to my 2 o'clock meeting. So I hope you'll really take into consideration everything that I've shared today.
Thank you very much. That's very powerful. And sorry to lose you. I don't know, the council may want to respond as well. I have one hand up online. Are there other, if there are other individuals who would like to speak or online, if you could raise your hand while we're taking comments in the room, and then I'll have just a sense of how much time we'll need overall. But we also have somebody in the room that would like to make a comment.
Yeah, hi, John Braban.
Can you, yeah, you might need to get closer to a mic so they can hear you online. There's one. Move this.
Great.
You mind?
Yeah. Hi. John Braban. I work for Vermonters for a Clean Environment, the environmental group that has not been allowed to participate in this in any real way, by the way, this process. But the issue of process in general, it's been brought up at this meeting and by Chair Emeritus Dean, who's now not here. You know, I struggle with the process or lack thereof to date. By way of background, I worked at the Agency of Natural Resources as a regulator for 25 years, actually more than that. And I was an 18-year member of the Town of Calais Select Board, so I'm pretty familiar with the process and regulatory process and the writing of legislation and the moving of legislation through the legislative committee process. I have both comments and questions that maybe I can get answered today with some of you in the room. I first want to say the in-person meeting setting is a hugely better situation than this online process, which I have not been able to endure, quite frankly. It's painful at best. Abby Corse was right that this process has not been transparent and wide open. And I just feel like by virtue of how this committee council has been established, that it had a predetermined bias. I know it's politically arrived at, but geez, man, this is like, it's stacked. And the outcomes were predictable. Joey, for instance, brought up that she did a lot of public engagement. I would wonder if it was engagement with folks on her activist lists or if it was the broader Vermont public. Was
It
that
was in 2011 and 2016. But
2011?
I'm just saying
Yeah,
what I
okay.
was referring to, because I want to correct that.
Well, you can
Follow
ask-
up with Anna too, but
Okay.
just want to clarify, that was just one, I was just suggesting there have been other public
Or
engagement
it
processes.
sounded like it was
that-
a process that engaged the
No.
entire Vermont public
No,
regarding this here. Okay, so I was,
far more work to do there.
okay. I have attended the Senate Environment and Energy Committee hearings on S5, the Affordable Heat Act. Heard Jared testify numerous times. Members of the public were given but one chance to testify for a maximum of 15 minutes. Jared's gotten hours upon hours of opportunity to testify. I have well, first let me say, Mr. Cowart, I wasn't too sure what he meant when he said that this is a consensus process. And I think that I sensed there was some pushback against Representative Dean's assertion that we need climate council needs a more formalized deliberative process with votes at the end on important policy matters that you move forward. By way of example, select boards in all your towns, they, yes, they make day-to-day decisions for your town government operations. But the most important day in Vermont government is town meeting day. And what select boards do is they develop a budget, they arrive at a budget, and they present it at town meeting before the electorate. It's advisory. We, as select board members, present a budget. It's our best effort at anticipating what the town's needs are going forward. And then we advise the electorate to support that. And changes are made on the floor. We are advisory, yet that budget is arrived at by a vote of the select board. So just want to put that out. That's how true democracy works. So I wanted to just kind of also put out and then ask a question. Information about S5, the Affordable Act, I think it's being called now, that the Senate Environment and Energy Committee, according to its chair, Senator Chris Bray, heard from 56 witnesses on S5. Not a single change was made to S5 as a result of the testimony of fuel dealers who everyone thinks they're just pumping oil and propane to our homes. They are also probably the majority installers of heat pumps, or a significant component to the installer population in the state of Vermont.
If I could, though, could I just pause you there and say that we're not here to talk about the substance of that particular
Well,
legislation.
I'm laying the groundwork so I can get to a question. Okay, and it has to do with your process that was brought up today, if I might. Okay, I've been a public that's been sitting out there for 2.5 years waiting to speak to you. Okay, so my question is, and I'm guessing you all know the legislation or legislative draft that was presented, that is now to the legislature, that has now been called S5, was in some way endorsed by this body. I don't know what that process was. So that's a question. How did you endorse that? How did that go forward? That legislation, to my understanding, was developed in private without public engagement by this entity, this anomalous entity called the Working Group. There are no names that have been identified in writing as to the participants and who presented that, to my knowledge. So I'd like information on that. I'd like to know if this body took a formal vote to endorse the actual language that was first presented to, I guess, Chair Bray and other committee members to create this S5 legislation. I also would like to understand that, so Mr. Duval was the lead presenter along with Mr. Cowart of this legislation. Mr. Duval has said time and again that he's an employee, executive director of EAN, Environmental Action Network, but he was presenting as a member of the Climate Council.
Okay, so this
Did-
goes again to the.
It goes to your process.
All right.
Was Mr. Duval selected by you all? Was there a vote by you to have him represent your collective interests? And is he giving voice to the myriad opinions of this council? That's a question, and I'd like to get an answer to that. Do you also support the development of what is the most significant environmental policy I've seen in my 38 years living in Vermont? The most significant environmental policy I've seen in terms of impact to the public. Did you all vote and support that language and support him in his effort in moving that? An important part of that is how biomass is accounted for and not accounted for in that bill. The biomass and the burning of that is considered this neutral effect on the climate. We all know it produces more greenhouse gas than burning of coal. Coal is,
Question about the process for that as well.
and yes, so did you all agree to bypass, circumvent, not consider the biomass task group's recommendations with regard to biomass? My understanding is it is yet to be brought up. You're moving legislation forward that doesn't account for biomass. In fact, rewards the expanded use of biomass in meeting our greenhouse gas reduction efforts, when actually we're that policy, which it is in that bill, only worsens. Whether or not there's good argument for it, I talked with Representative Dean about that. I get that. That's okay. Put all the cards on the table as to the pros and cons of burning biomass,
So,
but that's not what's going on. It's been discounted as being climate
Sorry.
neutral.
again, I'll just remind you, we're not going to talk about the substance of the bill. So if you.
I'm not talking, I'm asking. If you could let me finish
Well, I will.
and stop interrupting me, please. Would you let me finish?
I'd like.
My question is, why, if this body approved that legislation, which is highly complex, and by the way, did you all read it and understand its net effect? Did you approve that knowing the position it took with regard to biomass, which is contradictory to what the Biomass Task Force, your entity, recommended? So I want to know about whether Jared has been your appointed representative. I want to know whether this body considered what became S5 and took a vote on it and fully understands all the implications, including the biomass policy piece of that. And I guess that's about it. Thank you.
And I think we only have two other individuals with comments.
If you would like to make a comment to which you can't raise your hand. Judy Dow. Basically.
So I'm waiting, when will my questions be answered, at the end?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So, Annette, would you go next?
Yes, this is Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. And I want to note that this meeting has certainly shown the value of an in-person meeting. A couple of other comments on what's been said. I can assure you and attest that the general public has no idea of all of the climate action that is currently taking place. As I want to support what Michelle Boomhauer said, and it has come to me just this morning with someone who's, people are expressing a lot of anxiety and we have to do something. And I'm pointing out that we're doing a lot. This goes to your discussion about communication. That communication has not gotten out there of everything that is already in place. to follow up on what John was just saying and your question about whether your role is advisory or not, there is absolutely no question that the legislature views your role as not advisory. And that's how it's being presented to them, that the climate action plan has required us, in order to meet our emissions reduction goals, to pass the clean heat standard and to pass the low carbon fuel standard or the other transportation policy, that we have to do this, otherwise we're going to get sued. That's the message the legislators are getting. That's not an advisory role. That is, if that's not your intention, then you need to go to the legislators and say it. But this also goes to I think, Abby's frustration and those of us who spent a lot of time in ag and ecosystem, that Chris Campany said it more than once, this council needs to go back to the legislature and ask for the mandate to be changed. So it's not just about emissions reductions. And at the same time, you could ask them to remove the litigation part of it, because I don't think that's helping anything here. And so I hope you will have another in-person meeting where you actually talk about Chris Campany's recommendation. And finally, this occurred to me as David was making his comments about the plan to go out and do community outreach. As I think you just saw with what John Brabant said, S5 and the Affordable Heat Act is a real hot button topic. And if it gets passed by this year's legislature, and then you go out and say, oh, we want to hear from you, this is not going to be a pretty picture. And I work in Vermont's communities, and I can tell you that people are really upset and angry. And if you were respectful of Vermonters, you would go to the legislature and say, put a hold on this bill so we can do our outreach, because we should have done that and we haven't done that, and the time is now. So that's my specific, I have a couple of specific asks for you. I hope you will consider them. I am appreciative of the good work that is being done. I would like to see it publicized and acknowledged, and make sure that the people of Vermont are respected, which I don't think that this legislation that's currently moving is doing in a respectful way. Thank you.
To make your comments.
You're muted, Cheryl Joy.
I think Judy Dow is next. I'd like to go after Judy Dow.
I don't see Judy present. I think she left.
Yeah, she's not.
Okay. So, I hope I get to all the things I wanted to say. One thing is, I see that it is a good thing to have a in-person meeting. I was hoping to go up there, but I'm not up to it this time. Sorry. One question that I saw that Jane put into the chat was that the public portal is not available anymore. And I think that that's a mistake. I think it should be available so people can see what others have written, and so people can put things in there. I'm not sure why that would be taken down. I thought you want communication from the public. The other thing is that when you listen, I'm hoping that, and I'm one of the people that probably David was talking about that complained about giving public comment and not being paid attention to. So, more than, I think the public comments that are made need to be more than heard or more than listened to, but acted upon. And there's been numerous public comment on a lot of stuff so thank you for trying to move forward on making that happen. And I hope that the public comment in the meetings will generate as much respect as the meetings that you're going to plan to have 6 to 8 per year in different locations, because I think that that's part of it also. Of course, you're all probably who know me expecting me to talk about biomass, and I will. Don't want to disappoint you. I know that and Abby and Judy Dow and some others can confirm this, that before the original cap came out, there were recommendations with regard to biomass that Ag and Eco wanted to have in there. And this council said, no, we're not going to put that in because we need to study it more. So then it was studied and it was ready before the update for this year with the biomass task group was ready. And that was put off on numerous times and for various reasons. And maybe they were valid and maybe they weren't, but it doesn't matter. It was put off a long time. It was ready in November. And it's really an egregious mistake to continue to go forward with legislation on 2 different years, including something that a lot of people don't want in there because it's so damaging. And I also, you know, from those of you who know me, will say that it's not only carbon that we're looking at here, because if you're going to go ahead and, well, for one thing, burning biomass is not carbon neutral. And you all really know that. It's not a secret. But biodiversity is just as important as fixing the climate. If you don't look at the loss of biodiversity and the extinctions going on, that is incredible and unbelievable right now, and not address that while answering that, oh, that's okay because we're fixing the climate. You know, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're all gone for if we don't look at both things. You can't just look at climate, even though this is called the Vermont Climate Council. As others have said, that S5 is, you guys are stated as supporting this thing and nobody saw the support. I've only seen a lack of support in the different groups that have studied it. And but the council as a whole have suppressed it. And that's pretty much
Process around that you
the
wanted to
process. The question about process is the fact that you guys are suppressing things that are being decided with groups of, that you guys have just determined these groups of people to look at an issue, and they've come up with recommendations, and you've suppressed it. What's the process that is making this allowing this to occur? That's the process question.
Okay, thank you. Did you have anything else you wanted to say before we turn it back to the council?
Probably, but I'm recovering from COVID, and so my mind isn't like it was. I always have a good excuse for that. Thanks.
So, I've tried to capture some of the comments here and wanted to just give the council a chance to respond. Any of those that you think appropriate for response.
I was just gonna comment on there were a couple of folks who mentioned sort of the language of S5 and the council's endorsement of that. I think it was actually at a much higher level than that. And we had conversations as we were adopting recommendations, and frankly, it informed the letter that the administration sent, which is there were a handful of recommendations that we said there was no path to yes on. Others, it was essentially the devil is in the details, and we need to get to more details. So the idea that was included in the climate plan was not an endorsement of any policy that was labeled a clean heat standard or something akin to the Transportation Climate Initiative. It was saying that there's room in that space for continued discussion. And some of that discussion occurs at the council, but I think by virtue of the legislative calendar, some of it occurs in the legislature too. And I don't think it's news to anyone that there are a number of, at least of opinions held by counselors that have been expressed through that legislative process. And so there was no broad agreement on actual language. And I suspect that will continue to be true for the council's work going forward, that our agreements are sort of reached at a high level. And as folks dig into the details, whether in the agencies charged with doing rulemaking or the legislature charged in drafting policy, that those are the forums that for those more detailed conversations.
Public clarification. Thank you, Abby.
I do feel that I need to share there is something broken in the process regarding access for counselors to the legislature. I had the unique experience of last year not being able to testify to something on which I did possess expertise, but by which I was assumed to not possess expertise and credibility in, and then watch as other counselors were able to be in the room and testify. That is a specific type of experience that I hope nobody else has to have. It feels pretty awful to know that your voice is less valued in those chambers than others that you're supposed to be on a council with and be co-equal. And I hope that we can set up processes by which that does not continue to happen.
Yeah, I just want to respond to a couple of the questions that came up that were related to me and my work, both on the council and beyond. And I will just say, I have been, just so the entire council knows, as well as anybody who's interested here or listening, that anytime that I testify to the legislature, I'm very clear about the role in which I'm testifying. Energy Action Network, the organization that I lead, does not take positions on bills and it does not lobby for or against bills. And so when I testify in my capacity leading EAN, it is data and tracking and analysis and all of the information from our annual progress report, which legislators often want to know. I have also testified as a counselor, and in that role, we all passed a climate action plan that has specific recommendations around policies and recommended actions. And I think any counselor who is invited to testify by the legislature can testify in their capacity as a counselor from their own perspective, or on behalf of the council when we are speaking directly to something we have all agreed on. And I just want to be really clear. It seems like there's some confusion about where a clean heat standard came from. Page 98 of the climate action plan that we adopted by a vote of 19-4 says strategy number 1 in terms of reducing fossil fuel use in the thermal sector is to implement a clean heat standard. Action number 1 on the very next page says adopt legislation authorizing the Public Utility Commission to administer a clean heat standard consistent with the recommendations of the Clean Heat Standard Working Group. So I want to be really clear that this is not out of nowhere. The work that I and others are doing are consistent with a deliberately developed, carefully developed climate action plan that I think we all owe fidelity to. And so I just want to be clear that Clean Heat Standard was the #1 recommendation in the buildings and thermal sector. It is enshrined in our climate action plan. So just, and if people were wondering, where is it? Look at pages 98 and 99. It is very, very clear.
As a counselor, I feel I need to say that because of the timeline under which we were operating, it wasn't possible as a counselor to fully understand the ramifications of the policies that were being put forward. And then when asked to put input in, it was a fight to get there. Additionally, had I, for example, realized that the #1 policy that we were going to put forward as a council, I voted yes to the climate action plan because I believed in the work that had been done in my subcommittee, and I voted yes for that. I did not vote yes for the things
with which I did not have the ability to do a deep dive in. And I think there is some confusion in the public regarding that. Jared, I respect your opinion on this, but I will never go into the public and say that as a climate counselor, I was behind the clean heat standard, because I'm not. And I wasn't given an opportunity to share the expertise that needed to be shared so that I could have felt like I had put in from my sector, which is relevant when talking about clean heat, what needed to be shared there from that perspective.
I wanted to just put out a point of clarification, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this council has never, as a group, reviewed and voted on and approved the exact language of S5, correct?
That's really similar, yeah.
So yeah, I just wanted to, you said it, and I wanted to make sure that that was crystal clear. We have not approved or even necessarily all reviewed the full language of that bill, because we put forward the higher level thing as part of the climate action plan, as Jared said. The legislature is the one that's responsible for the actual language. And so that is where that stands, just to make sure that's crystal clear.
Well, thank you for addressing some of the specific questions that came up.
I just wanted to, process wise, I think this points to the minority decision piece that we talked about earlier, because I think if any one of us were going in to testify and we did have a minority communication available, that anytime we were representing the council, we would represent the entire story, which could arise from a minority opinion. That's all.
Please allow me to say something.
Yes, Cheryl, can you?
Thank you. Thank you. I think that we all probably want to have a clean heat standard, but nobody, and I don't believe that the endorsement of biomass and biofuels was a part of that climate action plan, because that was a contentious issue that was not supposed to be in the climate, that we want, that many people wanted it to be not in the recommended against, but it wasn't, it should definitely not have been endorsed. It's not in the climate action plan as an endorsed method. I am absolutely 100% in favor of having a clean heat standard, as I'm sure everybody is. But that's it. And so I just wanted to point that out.
I'd like an opportunity to speak. I will be brief. I just think it's inappropriate from a process standpoint for an entity to arrive at your own legislative effort, not vet it with the Climate Council, which is the lead operation, governmental, quasi-governmental operation that's supposed to be overseeing this, to go on their own, and then as individuals, whoever they are, to represent as Climate Council members their endorsement of legislation that the full body hasn't considered and had real input on. It would be like me as a town select board member saying, I'm a select board member from the town of Calais, and this is my position. Folks should understand that the public understanding is that this is a Climate Council bill. You folks, if you don't know that, I'm telling you, and the legislature understands that. If you talk to Dick McCormick, he would understand it as that. So you might want to write a letter of clarification that you do not necessarily endorse or oppose this legislation, that you've had no qualitative input on this, that this was done by a private organization, the working group, whoever that is. I know it's Green Mountain Power,
Okay.
Gas, et cetera.
Thank you.
Jared.
Thank you.
Should do that.
And, you know, these are all points that I think the council is going to need to be thinking about. They will be thinking about as they go in to consider their changes in their decision-making process, changes in the public engagement process. So I appreciate that you brought these points. Here's what we have left.
Can I just interrupt for a second? I think Judy Dow is back on
Oh,
it.
she's back.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Judy. Are you able to unmute and share your comments? Unfortunately, she's like seeking stuff. Yeah, I can't get her in. I don't think she's active. Well,
I can let you know when she is.
okay. And want to be sure we had enough time for the public comment, and so we pushed a couple of things out. I think take a moment to just get approval of the minutes from the last climate change. So could I ask while we're waiting?
He's still there. I can see him.
Okay. Judy, do you have comments you want to share with us?
I do. I'm sorry, I got booted off and it took a call to Infinity to figure it out.
Welcome back.
It's nothing like waiting 4 hours to talk. That's really unusual for me. I'm not patient with waiting. Thank you for listening to my questions. I love that you want to communicate with the public more often. However, I'm really worried about trust. And some of what I've heard here is an example of that. So for instance, the two women who were chosen to talk with communities, they don't, this might seem a little racist, but they don't seem to be BIPOC. Could somebody please tell me if they're BIPOC people?
There's not, are you talking about the public engagement team?
Yeah, Kashka and Anne.
Indra.
Indra,
sorry, is a man.
Yeah,
okay. Okay, so we've been having all this talk about equity and inclusion and BIPOC, and then you create a committee of people who aren't BIPOC. What is this? So I'm not so sure that people with a lack of trust. Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. Indra is BIPOC, but I'm not so sure that your expectation that these people will be able to walk into BIPOC communities just like that and find out what the issue is. These trust relationships take years to build. So I'm a little concerned about banking on that and the fact that you're not quite walking the talk as far as inclusion and BIPOC and all of that. My next question is, somebody made a comment about $20 million for electric cars. Where's the equity with this? Where are these people in these communities that you want to talk to going to get the money to afford this when you see them standing in line at the grocery store slowly taking out one piece of food after another one because they can't afford the food they're trying to buy? A discount or an incentive is not going to solve it. It's not going to solve the problem if they can't buy food. The next thing is, people have been making comments about we need to learn from the implementers. You don't need to learn so much from the implementers as you do the people who are impacted by this. Nobody mentioned that those impacted. I heard several times how you were going to make sure you learned from those that were implementing. Could you please tell me how you're going to do that? How are you going to learn from those who are implementing these processes when you don't hear from those who aren't implementing because they're impacted? I see you wiggling. I see you feeling uncomfortable, and you should be feeling uncomfortable because you're talking this talk about being equitable, but nobody used the word today. Nobody presented how you're going to be equitable. Here's another question. It would not be equitable to go to just the electrical unions, as somebody suggested. Many of the electricians in the state, my husband included, do not belong to the union. So if you're going to go out there and get information, you have to be inclusive. You can't just go to the obvious for impact and information. As far as equity is concerned, you can't assume those 4 categories you've been talking about today has equity in it, because you never mentioned it. You never mentioned it once when you were talking about all of those 4 categories. You should not be taking a step to the table without talking about equity. You shouldn't be doing it, yet you just spent the whole day talking about those columns, those 4 categories, and never once put equity in it. A minority report. Somebody mentioned there should be a minority report. There clearly should be a minority report. The first year I was on the Ag and Ecosystems Committee, and the second, and the Biomass Task Force, I wrote a minority report. We were never told or suggested, or was it ever suggested there could be a minority report the following years. The only time we knew that the Biomass Task Force report was not going to be considered was when it didn't show up in the report. And that's when we all came to the January meeting and complained about that. A minority report definitely should be a part of this, but how do we know? How do the people on the committee know to do that if you don't tell us the process and when the time is to do that? I joined this committee because I have deep concerns about the biomass report, and I think we need a motion from the floor. If people are coming to this committee with preconceived notions to do damage to 10 months of work without understanding one bit of it, you got a problem before you kick this off. Before you even kick it off, you have people coming to this meeting with preconceived notions. What good will it be to listen to people? What good will it be to listen to the BIPOC? What good will it do to listen to the impacted if you already have preconceived messages and notions? Before I got kicked off, I heard John say 56, I think it was 56 people spoke about S5, and not one word was picked up. There was scholars, there was scientists, there were impacted people who spoke, and for not one word to be picked up, the process stinks. The process shows partisanship. And when you admit people into your group who show partisanship from day one, you're doomed to repeat yourself. Hang on, I think I have 1 or 2 more.
Judy, we're 10 minutes past. Yeah, could you make your last couple of points?
Yes, I can. Thank you. How did you determine who the public organizers or engagement officers would be, or folks would be? How did you determine that? What is their criteria? How did you come up with a criteria? Because I was on a meeting last August, the life cycle analysis meeting, and they already talked about Kashka being hired. They just had to come up with the money. So this, again, is another preconceived notion. This ball is rolling without input from the appropriate people. And it needs to stop. It needs to stop rolling until you consider what you're doing. And Anna's concerned about the process is equally the same as mine. Anna in January spoke, as did I, about the process. And apparently we weren't heard, or we were heard and not listened to, because there is little action in walking the talk. Thank you for listening. Will I get answers today or later?
I think actually, a lot of the points that you brought up are things that during the course of today has said that they need to take up in considering the rework of their process, the rework of decision-making, their public engagement strategy. So I think some of those answers will be coming in the course of their further deliberations on those issues. But if there's anything that the council wants to say specifically, we have a few minutes. Yes.
I wanted to say, I'm sorry that you didn't feel that the questions about process were heard, because my understanding about how this agenda for today was framed was a big conversation at the beginning was, hey, we had some questions and concerns raised at our last meeting. We need to talk about process. So my understanding was that the agenda today was actually created directly in response to the concerns that you and Anna and others raised at the January meeting. So I'm really sorry that you still didn't feel heard after that, and what most of us were speaking about, and some of it was in small groups, so I'm sorry you couldn't hear every single thing that was said, but was that we have a lot of work to do, but we want to keep doing better every time, and so we really value all of the input that you and other members of the public are giving, and we can't always act immediately, and we wish we could. So keep bringing your questions and concerns. They're really important, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. If this is true, how come equity never showed up in those 4 categories?
Got it written on our charts here. You may not have been able to hear it, but it was raised a number of times. It's up on the wall on the charts.
Okay, it wasn't typed into the chat. We saw a lot of it, but we didn't see that. And it should be in all 4 categories. You shouldn't be moving forward without considering it. And you should have people on this committee who are considerate of that, not people who know nothing about it.
Thank you. So we have more. Yeah.
So Judy, one of the things that I brought up,
You're gonna have to speak up, Leslie, and they can't hear you very well.
all right,
Or move a mic closer.
Judy, this is Leslie Ann. Not sure if you can see me over here. One of the things that I brought up in response to an initial prompting question was, what would success look like? And for me, success would look like all the folks here, not just in this room, becoming trusted and trusted brokers, because as both of us know, trust is absolutely key. And so in addition to the 4 categories, the 4 buckets that you saw on the page or that got typed in, there was a 5th category, which was, I liked it to be a little bit more overarching. And it had things like thinking as a system, becoming a trusted broker, sort of flipping the way that we do things on its head. And so I'm guessing, or I'm hoping that when we get everything typed up, that overarching piece would be one of the pieces that would be in the actual official record. Because you're right, trust is at the key of everything. And that's one of the things that I was specifically mentioning, because that's the space that I sit in as well. So I just wanted to highlight that. So even if you can't see it, it's written physically under the governance piece in here, because that's where they had the most space at that particular point in time, but it's there. So I just wanted to assure you that it's not lost because it's overarching.
Thank you, Leslie. It should be in every category, but if your intent of that last category was move it into all categories, that would be great.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we had hoped to have more time to the integration of the work that you did up here, timelines and public engagement presentation that you heard. I did look at lunchtime at where I was seeing some common themes on your timelines for your milestone lists. And I can say that every group had 2 things as a priority for the next 3 months. And that was governance questions, all the questions that have been raised today around the governance and the process. And the other one was the biomass recommendations. Those were two that everybody wants to put light up on the timeline. The other thing that I saw across, I think at least three of them, was to execute on the engagement strategy and start listening immediately and thinking about. So there was those three things, and the other part that went along with the biomass was prioritizing. With some sort of prioritization process overall for you to come up with your own priorities, both on the process, I mean, writ large, sort of on all your issues. So, you know, we can take more time. We will transcribe these for you so you have a chance to look at them. I think right now, maybe the best thing to do to wrap up would be just to look at our next steps and talk about how we're going to start integrating some of the work that you did today. We're actually going to move it forward. We have a slide on next steps. Can you do that? One is to put the biomass task force recommendations on the agenda for your April meeting. Would love if you could confirm that that's going to be one of the next the first two Mondays or the second and third Monday in April. And then there's a suggestion here that the staff and the facilitator can interact in revisions process roadmap. I think I heard from some others that maybe that's a subgroup of the council that should begin that work. So would love to hear if you think that that's the way that process should move forward, but that's something that can start between now and the next meeting so that you have something to react to at the next meeting. So if I get any kind of reaction to how you would like to see that process move forward. And then I think there is the intent to begin this public engagement process as soon as possible, and providing you, as David said, maybe with more of the details with the actual engagement plan that he's about to lay out, so that you have a chance to give him additional feedback. Those are the major changes. Did you want to add anything?
Oh, that was great.
Those were the major next steps. And I'm sorry we didn't have more time to just do some of that integrated thinking at the end. But I think we actually had time to synthesize notes and hard to see a little bit more of the clarity around what it is that needs to happen. And I would just turn to you for last comments. We close out the reflection.
Just one thought on the third bullet point. I would suggest that, clearly the process roadmap at the end of the day is going to need to be considered on and adopted or approved any revisions by the full council. But so that's not just staff and facilitators beginning that process, so that there is councilor engagement. One of the things we've done in the past with the process roadmap that may make sense to do again is have the steering committee look at a draft and work on that with staff and facilitators, so that there can be input at that kind of small group level before, in some council or steering committee feedback before it goes to the full council. So I would just suggest that as a friendly amendment, that staff and facilitators with the steering committee, and then of course those meetings are open to the full council. So if other councilors wanted to join, but just so there was a dedicated space and place to consider some of those process roadmap.
Yeah.
I think that's a great idea. And along the lines, at the Just Transitions Committee on Thursday, I think we're also going to be having a conversation about what Just Transition sees as its role going forward. So we're already beginning that kind of conversation. We'll make sure that that gets relayed back to decision makers and people drafting that update.
Yeah, I would just add, I think it should be steering committee and facilitator, not staff. But, okay. I just wonder about the focus on the biomass task force recommendations. Like maybe the steering committee could think about what we would be doing with those recommendations
as it relates to our earlier discussions around, is this an addendum? You know, how do we vote addendums and all of that sort of thing. So I think that needs a little more processing before it just becomes an agenda item next month.
And for those few of you who have not heard, I am very concerned about the biomass report. I do not think it does justice to that segment of energy. And I certainly would like to have some additional consideration of at least information that I was able to find on my own prior to the council taking action on the report. And in conversation with Jane, just because, again, my background is legislative, on terms of a motion, I was going to ask that it be returned to committee. And that the committee continue their work on gathering information about the usefulness or lack of usefulness of biomass as a generation source for electricity. Now, whether I'll do that or not, I at this point, I don't know. This has gotten way out of control, in my opinion. Some of the things that have been said at this meeting, this is my first meeting, so I didn't want to be a true a-hole on my first meeting, but I will challenge the denigration of members of this council that are out of order, would be out of order on the floor of the House, out of order in any meeting operating under Robert's Rules of Order. So a little tweaked here, but
Council
just
doesn't
to-
operate with Robert's Rules of Order. That was a decision that was made initially from.
well, it doesn't matter. There's a sense of rightness about debate. Debate the issue. Don't put up a straw person and slam the person. And, that is just unfair. So anyhow, I don't know how to work this out. I wanted to talk with the chair. She's left. Good move on her part. And I maybe do it over a phone or through Jane or you can broker a meeting or something. And the other thing to the co-chair, I have to be assigned to a committee. I have no official place in the world in this organization.
Yes, and I assume Paula would say the same. Yeah, we will work to
Okay,
solicit your interest in the different committees and figure out what.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
As people are leaving, on a lighter note, there's way too much food. So I'd like you all to take a what we're calling a burrito. Do make one for you.
Right.
Thank you.
Special shout out to all the people who are still online. Good to have you with us.
Oh, she's got the speaker there to.
Thanks, Leslie, and good to see you.